Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 76, and today we're going to be looking at the story of the Magi in Matthew's Gospel. A few years ago, back in 2007, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, was appearing on the Simon Mayo show, which I was a regular listener to at the time. And I felt sorry for the Archbishop because he was getting all sorts of cross-examination from Simon Mayo about whether he believed certain aspects of the story. Did he believe in the virgin birth? Did he believe that Jesus was born in a stable? Did he believe in the star above the stable, and so on? And one of the things that made the conversation kind of fascinating was that the questions being asked presupposed a certain harmonized, creative, legendary view of the gospel narrative. And when he got to the question about the three kings, he said to the then Archbishop, he asked him if he believed that there were indeed three wise men, and Rowan Williams replied by saying, well, he didn't think that there were three of them and they weren't kings. And one of the things that then happened is you got British newspapers like the Telegraph, which always used to have it in for Rowan Williams, saying, it proves that Rowan Williams doesn't really believe in any of the Christmas story. But what he was trying to say when he got to the question of the three kings was, well, there's nothing in Matthew's Gospel that says there are three of them. There's nothing in Matthew's Gospel that says that they're kings. And it's Matthew's Gospel that we go to for that story. Of course, he's right about that. And it's one of those cliches of New Testament interpretation. One of those things we always kind of get to is they're not three and they're not kings.
We three kings of Orient are bearing gifts, we traverse afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star.
It is, I suppose, quite amazing that this idea of three kings has really stuck around. I mean, what Matthew actually says is that there were Magi who visited Jesus, and the term Magi isn't too familiar to us. The singular is Magus, and there's another one of these characters in the New Testament, and he's a baddie. He's a Simon Magus that you meet in Acts of the Apostles. And I suppose it's true that you're not going to have popular Christmas carols that say, we several Magi of Orient are. We three kings of Orient are has got that very natural ring to it. The three isn't completely unrepresented in the text. The three, of course, is there because you have three gifts that the wise men bring: frankincense, gold, and myrrh. So that is where the inference comes about there being three of them. And I suspect also it's something of that rule of three that people love in popular storytelling. I mean, even Matthew, later in his own gospel, in Matthew 25, when you have the story of the parable of the talents, the whole story works around the idea of there being three of them. So the storytelling works quite often with three people. It's no coincidence that lots of nativity plays also give you three shepherds when they're drawing in the shepherds from Luke's Gospel. I suppose the idea of them being kings rather works because it's always very difficult when you're doing school nativity plays or church nativity plays to work out how to dress people. I mean, when you've got Joseph and when you've got the shepherds, usually a dressing gown will do, or stick a tea towel on their head, something like that. And the nice thing about making kings present is that you can give the kids at school lots of fun making crowns. I can remember doing it at school, making crowns for kings for the nativity play. So I suppose that's where the appeal of that comes from. But we should actually get down into the story itself and see what's actually going on in Matthew's story of the Magi and work out if there's anything interesting that we can find out about the story. Since we're looking in detail at the story, and since you hear enough of my voice already on the NT Pod, then I thought it'd be a good idea to get someone else to read it for us. And there's a lovely reading that Johnny Cash, the legendary Johnny Cash, once did of reading Matthew's Gospel. And so we'll excerpt from Johnny Cash's reading. This is Matthew chapter 2.
Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then, being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way.
Now, although we don't have three kings in Matthew's story, it's interesting that we do have kingship as a major theme in this story. It really is a very important theme. And it's because in Matthew's story, the Magi interact with King Herod. And this is all about King Herod, this story. And one of the reasons that I think Matthew wants to push this interest in King Herod is so that we can have a glorious contrast going on between this bloated, old, illegitimate, problematic king, King Herod, contrasted with the legitimate, rightful Son of God, King Jesus. And if you think about Matthew's birth narrative, the entire birth narrative is set up with this kind of contrast in view. So it's worth remembering that King Herod, Herod the Great, even though fantastically successful politically, had all sorts of problems in reigning over Judea. And one of the issues was that people just didn't think he was legitimate. They didn't think that he was descended from King David. They didn't even think he was Jewish, lots of them, because he was an Idumean. And so King Herod always had that legitimacy problem. And in contrast to this King Herod, Matthew's telling us right from the beginning of the gospel, right from the get-go, as Americans would say, that Jesus is from the line of David. So Matthew begins the whole gospel with Son of David being prominent in that genealogy. And Matthew doesn't just have David prominent in the genealogy, but all of Jesus's heritage goes through lots and lots of kings. So it's like Matthew is saying straight at the beginning that now we are going to meet the true Son of David, the true King of Israel. And that contrasts, of course, massively then with King Herod, who lots of people would have seen as not a legitimate king. You've also got at the same time this stress on Bethlehem in the story. And the reason for the stress on Bethlehem is that Bethlehem is David's city. And Matthew's very keen to make that point very clear as well. I sometimes wonder if Matthew, when he's stressing Son of David, Bethlehem, kingship so much, whether he's actually responding to one of the oddities in Mark's Gospel, which Matthew certainly used, in my opinion, and regular listeners of the NT Pod will know that I've often been banging on about Matthew's use of Mark as well as Luke's use of Mark. And one of the things that happens with respect to Matthew's use of Mark is that Mark doesn't really talk about Jesus as a son of David much at all. In fact, it never appears on Jesus' lips or the narrator's lips. So it may be that Matthew's doing a little bit of a corrective here and trying to emphasize that this Jesus really is the Messiah from the line of David. And so Bethlehem is stressed as well. And not only is that Jesus' legitimacy descended from David and from David's line, that's not just a stress of the genealogy and through Bethlehem, but also through prophecy. So we have this prophecy that Matthew brings through from Micah 5:2, where the future ruler, the shepherd of the people Israel, will come from Bethlehem. And then intertwined with this story about the legitimate king of the Jews being born in Bethlehem, you have a whole bunch of foreigners coming to worship him. So it's not just that Jesus appears for his people, but you have foreigners coming as the first fruit of the Gentiles to worship him. And this idea of wanting to worship Jesus is also a key theme in Matthew's gospel. He often has people approaching Jesus and kneeling down and worshipping him. So here, the first people who come to worship Jesus are foreigners, are Gentiles. Matthew probably here wants to encourage the reader to see Jesus not just as the King of the Jews, but also the King of all creation. And he ends his gospel with this great commission that Jesus gives, where Jesus says that he basically, the resurrected Jesus tells the disciples to go and preach to all the nations. And it's striking that Matthew's gospel, which we so often think of as the most Jewish of the gospels, is the one that also begins the whole gospel with these Gentiles coming to worship Jesus and ends his gospel with the promise of the gospel going out to all the nations, or all the Gentiles. It's interesting too that the term King of the Jews comes in this passage, and it's a strange term. We don't often pause to think about it, but it's really an outsider's term, King of the Jews. When Americans talk about the British Queen, I notice that they often call her the Queen of England, and it's not something that we Brits tend to say. We don't say the Queen of England, we just say the Queen, because it's taken for granted that she's the Queen of England. She's the one we're talking about. There's even an American TV series called The Royals, in which they regularly, even though they're supposedly the royal family, talk about the Queen of England. The thing is, characters internal to the drama in Matthew's Gospel who are Jewish don't generally say something like King of the Jews, King of the Judeans. What they generally would say is talk about kingship, son of David, that kind of thing. It's only really outsiders that use that term King of the Jews. And that's why in Matthew's Gospel, the only people who ever use the term King of the Jews are the Magi that you have here in Matthew 2. And then later on we get it when Jesus is being crucified and you have Pontius Pilate on the scene, you have that other Gentile on the scene. So the rather delightful irony about the false characterization of the Magi as being the three kings, we actually find that kingship and legitimate kingship is probably the major theme in this passage in Matthew's Gospel. And it's something that makes the story completely fit Matthew's purposes of making Jesus, this Christ, the Son of David, the one who will ultimately not only rule over his people, but also will receive worship from all the nations to whom the gospel, he thinks, is now going out. Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always good to have a Christmas episode of the NT Pod. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. Or you can find me on iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. I've got a Facebook page, just look for the NT Pod there, or on Twitter. And I hope to be along soon with some more episodes. And it's always good to have your company. Thanks very much for listening. Bye-bye.